Okay, thanks. Well, I better hang up with you then. Okay, thanks, Timothy. Welcome to tonight's discussion of Dharma and Thinking. I'll just begin with paying respects to the Blessed One. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Homage to the blessed, noble and perfectly self-awakened one. Homage to the blessed, noble and perfectly self-awakened one. Homage to the blessed, noble and perfectly self-awakened one. So, I decided to do a talk about thinking because it's a topic that comes up a lot in terms of in discussions about meditation and in discussions about the practice. And I've found it helpful to understand what precisely the Blessed One actually says on the topic of thinking. So I'm going to begin tonight with Dvedhāvitakka Sutta, and I'll read through and from time to time perhaps stop to elucidate a particular passage. Those of you who've listened to suttas before will recognise the familiar opening passages, but for those of you who are new to suttas, I'll just explain what a sutta is and what the opening passage is. So sutta, or in the Mahayana Sutra, hello again. So this is the Dvedhāvitakka Sutta, or the two kinds of thought talk or discourse. So this is a discourse or preaching or lecture that the Buddha gave, and the beginning passages explain where the Buddha was at the time that he gave this talk and to who it was he gave the talk to. So in this case, the Buddha, and it starts out with Evam me suttam, or so I've heard, thus have I heard, which indicates that this is an oral tradition and that this information was passed down from person to person in the early days. So I've heard. At one time, the Buddha was staying near Savatthi in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's monastery, which is where most of the talks were given. There, the Buddha addressed the mendicants. Mendicants, Venerable Sir, they replied. This means that the monks and nuns were the most senior in terms of social status, the most senior members of the audience. It is also possible that there were laymen and laywomen present at this talk, but the most senior people present were the bhikkhus and bhikkhunis. Well, maybe the bhikkhunis were there. It says bhikkhu. So, the Buddha says this: mendicants, before my awakening, and by the way, the English word mendicant means someone who takes an offering bowl and requests offerings. At least I think that's what it means. Perhaps we should double check in our dictionary. Anyway, so here he's talking about before he attained awakening, when he was still unawakened but intent on awakening. So, mendicants, before my awakening, when I was still unawakened but intent on awakening. Intent on awakening, in the Pali, that's bodhisatta sat aseva. So that ending would have that meaning of intention there, I would imagine. What does it say in the... why don't I meditate by continually dividing my thoughts into two classes? Now, this is a very important line here. This is him describing his own meditation practice that led him to awakening. This is not the useless practices. This is clearly a useful practice, and it's why he's teaching it. So before his awakening, when he was intent upon awakening, I had that as his goal, he thought, why don't I meditate by continually dividing my thoughts into two classes? Clearly, this analysis of thoughts, this thought belongs into this class, this thought belongs into this class, is meditation. So working with the thinking in this way is a form of meditation. I say this over and over again here because so many people have expressed to me that they think that meditating is the state of having no thoughts. And whilst that is true, there is a form of meditating where no thoughts are experienced. It's not the only form of meditation. So, what are these two classes that the Bodhisattva, Buddha to be, divided his thoughts into? So he assigned one class as, so I assigned sensual, malicious and cruel thoughts to one class, and I assigned thoughts of renunciation, goodwill and harmlessness to the second class. Those of you familiar with the Buddha's teachings will see the familiar ethical breakdown here. On one side, we have sensual, malicious and cruel thoughts, which is the akusala, the harmful, the non-beneficial. And on the other side, we have thoughts of renunciation, goodwill and harmlessness, which fall into the familiar category of kusala, or beneficial, and at the very least non-harmful. So here he is meditating by observing his thoughts and discerning the ethical quality to those thoughts. Is this thought that's arising now in this moment. So we're in the present moment. We're being mindful of what is happening in the present moment when what is happening in the present moment is thinking. Because in some of the moments that we have in our experience of our life, thinking is the thing that is happening, or at least one of the things that is happening. And so mindfulness in the present moment of whatever is arising and passing away can definitely include mindfulness of thoughts that are arising and passing away. And if we're being mindful of thoughts that are arising and passing away, what are we supposed to do with them? Clearly, mindfulness alone is not enough. It's not enough to just go, oh yes, there's a thought of anxiety again, and there's another thought of anxiety, or there's a thought of ill will, not liking. There's a thought of desire, liking. All that liking or sensual thoughts, disliking, thoughts of ill will. Just watching them going, oh yes, there's a thought, is not enough. We need to go, there's a thought and it's harmful or beneficial. Which is it? When the thoughts are really gross, intense, full on, strong, big, large, it's easier to discern, work out what the ethical and moral quality of that thought is. But when we've got more subtle thoughts like, for example, right now, my mouth's a bit dry, I think I'll have some water. Is this harmful or beneficial? Hard to say, really, isn't it? When it's something quite subtle, like, shall I have a drink in the middle of a Dharma talk? Not quite sure. Going to have to inspect that one, aren't we? And that's all we can do, right? Inspect it, ponder it. Think, is that of benefit to me, or is that of harm to me? Is that of benefit to others? Is that of harm to others? Which of these two categories does that thought fall in? Of course, when we start on this, it's probably good to start with the bigger, stronger, more obvious candidates for putting into two classes, one of the two classes, till we get more skillful at it. Then, once we've got a bit more skill at discerning whether a thought is harmful or beneficial, then we can start working with the more subtle thoughts. So, what else does the Blessed One say? So, he's decided to assign it into two classes. And then as he meditated, diligent, keen and resolute, a sensual thought arose. The first time I read this, I found that a little bit shocking. This is the Bodhisattva, This is like after he'd left Ramaputta and Alama Kalara, or whatever his name is, those two meditation teachers that he'd bested. So he was like a seriously super excellent meditator even before he was a Buddha. And this seriously super excellent meditator, he says, Then as I meditated, diligent, keen and resolute. Notice he's not saying he's not good enough. Essential thought arose. So here he's got all the really good qualities. He's meditating, he's diligent, he's keen and he's resolute, so he's not being lazy. And even though he's doing the job really well here, diligent, keen and resolute, essential thought arose. Anyway, notice he doesn't go into harsh judgment. Oh, I shouldn't be thinking this thought. I'm not meditating properly if I'm thinking this thought. No, that's not what he does. That's not the process that the Blessed One goes into here. What the process that the Blessed One goes into, he explains as, I understood. So essential thought arose. I understood this essential thought has arisen in me. And here, look at that impersonal language. Not I am thinking, but a thought has arisen in me. And not just any thought. We've got the wisdom discernment faculty operating here. It's essential thought. So he's managed to understand two things in this moment. Essential thought, a thought has arisen, and that it's essential thought. This is a very different and equanimous process to going, oh no, I shouldn't be thinking, or I can't meditate because I'm thinking. An equanimous process is, I understand that in this moment a thought has arisen. I understand that the thought that has arisen is essential thought, and this essential thought has arisen in me. Then he takes the analysis further. He doesn't drop it at that part. He really goes into what it means to him and to others that this is essential thought. This is essential thought. What is the impact on my life, my experience, my karma? What is the impact of that thought, or the potential impact on other people's lives and other people's experience? So the potential impact here, this is leads to. This is an impact that hasn't occurred yet. So the thought has arisen and now exists. The existence of this thought could lead to, very likely leads to, if I don't do something about this, it will lead to hurting myself, hurting others, hurting both. And if that's not bad enough, it blocks wisdom. It's on the side of anguish, and it doesn't lead to extinguishment. That seems pretty dire to me. Then, of course, so this is a strong analytical process here. He's doing really a subha, as in looking at the non-beautiful of the thinking. What's really non-beautiful about this? And as a result of understanding, and this pajanami, understand, pajanami, to understand. It's all very well if you just run it through your mind as like a sequence of words. That's not what he's talking about. This to look at it, analyze it, and get that, oh, 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 you know that? Really, that moment of really seeing how having this thought harms me. You know, when you drop something and you, even before it's hit the floor, you know the smash that's going to happen. Yeah? That thing. And you see this thought and you can see the energy and power it has and the smash that's going to happen. No thanks. And when you really see that deeply, when he reflected that it leads to hurting myself, it went away. When I reflected that it leads to hurting others, it went away. When I reflected that it leads to hurting both, it went away. When I reflected that it blocks wisdom, it's on the side of anguish and doesn't lead to extinguishment, it went away. Clearly, this reflection is accompanied by this deep understanding. And since he's bodhisattva here and he's not in jhana, this is a mundane level of understanding, or at least that's how I understand it. This appears to me to be a mundane level of understanding such that the thought will go away. Because we're not interested in something so unbeautiful, so ill. I think it's like when the understanding of its hurtfulness is like when the mind experience the owl properly. You know, when you touch a hot stove, you don't have to have an intellectual process to go, ow. The experience of ow and your hand comes off straight away. So here we are having an intellectual process, but the seeing, the understanding of the hurtfulness of this is when the heart and the mind connects with the ow, you know, with the pain, with the future dukkha that this thought can cause. So he gave up, I gave up, got rid of, and eliminated any sensual thoughts that arose. So notice he's just not tolerating them being around. He gave up, got rid of, and eliminated those sensual thoughts. The process repeats. So having developed this process, he can use this process again and again for every other type of thought that's in the harmful category. So as he meditated, diligent, keen and resolute, a malicious thought arose, a cruel thought arose, and he understood. This cruel thought has arisen in me. It leads to hurting myself, hurting others, and hurting both. It blocks wisdom. It's on the side of anguish and doesn't lead to extinguishment. When I reflected that it leads to hurting myself, hurting others, hurting both, it went away. When I reflected that it blocks wisdom, it's on the side of anguish and it doesn't lead to extinguishment. It went away. So I gave up, got rid of, and eliminated any cruel thoughts that arose. Now he's going to talk about the pattern. Whatever a mendicant frequently thinks about and considers, that it becomes their heart's inclination. Perhaps a habit, if you like. So if you think about it all the time, then you get into a habit. And the more you think about it, the more you think about it. And then the more you think about it, the more you think about it, the more you think about it. And so you get these great habitual thought patterns that run on their own momentum. So if we often think about and consider sensual thoughts, they've given up the thoughts of renunciation to cultivate sensual thoughts, and their mind inclines to sensual thoughts. If they often think about and consider malicious thoughts, their mind inclines to malicious thoughts. If they often think about and consider cruel thoughts, their mind inclines to cruel thoughts. So basically, if you let your mind think those cruel thoughts, those malicious thoughts, those sensual thoughts, you're rehearsing them. You're training yourself to become more skillful in thinking malicious thoughts. Even if you don't do it on purpose. Well, none of us do it on purpose, right? Or very few, I would think. But if we allow those malicious thoughts, those cruel thoughts, those sensual thoughts to hang around and persist, then we rehearse them, we train in them, we become more skillful in them, which is not exactly that beneficial for us. In fact, it becomes really harmful when we become skillful in harmful types of thoughts. So we shouldn't tolerate those thoughts. We should be careful and mindful that they're coming up and tap them away quickly. Suppose it's the last month of the rainy season when the crops grow closely together and a cowherd must take care of the cattle. He'd tap them and poke them with his staff on this side and that to keep them in check. Why is that? For he sees that if they wander into the crops, he could be executed, imprisoned, fined, or condemned. In the same way, I saw that unskillful qualities have the drawbacks of sordidness and corruption, and that skillful qualities have the benefit and cleansing power of renunciation. So basically, if we allow those harmful thoughts to roam around in our minds, unchecked, unherded, unguarded, then they will eat up our carefully cultivated crop of goodness, our carefully cultivated crop of virtue, our carefully cultivated crops of generosity and kindness. We'll get eaten up by these marauding herds of negative thought cattle. So we don't want to have a marauding herd of cattle trampling through our kindness and goodness. We want to have a cow herd that's on the job. No, don't be doing that. No, out of there, And catch those sordid, corrupt thoughts. And really, each of us has to can know which of our thoughts are sordid and corrupt and which of them are really beautiful and worthy of being present. And unless you catch those thoughts, analyse them, and work out whether they are beneficial or harmful, how will you know whether you've got cattle trampling your crops or not? So now the Buddha analyses the good thinking, the beneficial thinking. Then, as I meditated, diligent, keen and resolute, a thought of renunciation arose. I understood. This thought of renunciation has arisen in me. It doesn't lead to hurting myself, hurting others, or hurting both. It nourishes wisdom, it's on the side of freedom from anguish, and it leads to extinguishment. If I were to keep on thinking and considering this all night, all day, all night and day, I see no danger that would come from that. Still, thinking and considering for too long would tire my body. And when the body is tired, the mind is stressed. And when the mind is stressed, it's far from immersion. So I stilled, settled, unified, and immersed my mind internally. Why is that? So my mind would not be stressed. So let's look at this passage here. Go up a bit. So considering a thought of renunciation or kindness or generosity or the others as we'll go through shortly, that it's not harmful and there's no danger from it. So if you must think, then this is the kind of thinking to be going on with. However, too much thinking and thinking is tiring. I think we've all experienced that when we're really doing a lot of thinking. For example, when we're students, all that studying is really tiring. And if we're anxious and we're overthinking something, it's exhausting. But here the Buddha's saying that even, thinking, doing metta chanting all night is still quite tiring. And when the body is tired, the mind is stressed. So, having decided that he would give up thinking, he mentions, so I stilled, settled, unified, and immersed my mind. So here we are reminded that this is a highly skilled meditator here. But notice that even the Bodhisattva, Buddha-to-be, did not say that his mind stilled and settled when he was having the unwholesome thoughts. If he was having unwholesome thoughts, he abandoned those unwholesome thoughts first, brought his mind to a beautiful state, and since thinking was still going on, I'm assuming it's that non-harmful thinking he's talking about, of renunciation or goodwill or harmlessness. But having these thoughts of goodwill and harmlessness, being a skilled meditator, he's able to go easily from thoughts of goodwill and harmlessness and renunciation to a mind that it is stilled, settled, unified, and immersed. So if we want to set up the conditions For our minds to still, as in have no thinking, to be still, to be settled, that is, to be not shaken by emotional reactions, unified, which I'm pretty sure means jhana here, samadhi, and samadhi means jhana, and immersion means jhana here. So, although I think the word ekodim probably means unified, come to one point. Rather than struggling and trying to push ourselves into stillness and immersion when harmful thinking is still arising from time to time, this sutta indicates to me that we need to do a stepwise process here of, first of all, letting go of the harmful thinking, bringing up a positive state of mind, and bringing up a positive chitta is very often helped, I've noticed, by doing some positive thinking with the sort of manasikara, so manasikara, some wise reflection. Very often, beginning with wise reflection will result in the chitta or the heart coming to a beautiful place. Once the heart's in a beautiful place, once the mind is happily having beautiful wise reflections, then it's possible to let go of that thinking so that the mind stills, settles, unifies, and becomes immersed in samadhi. But if even the bodhisattva could not enter into samadhi from the point of having unwholesome thoughts, then surely we shouldn't be having unreasonable expectations of ourselves. So that's two kinds of thoughts, and the simile here is, suppose it's in the last month of summer when all the crops have been gathered in. A cowherd must take care of the cattle, but while at the root of a tree or in the open, he need only be mindful that the cattle are there. In the same way, I needed only to be mindful that these things were there. So, in this way, we need to guard very carefully if the unwholesome thinking is arising and work with it quite strongly, like investigating it, analysing it, understanding the harmful effect. Whereas if wholesome thinking is present, we just need to be aware, oh yeah, wholesome thinking is present. And we don't really necessarily have to do anything particularly active about it. Just be, in a much more passive way, be mindful of its presence. This is much more the classic passively observing thinking. Passively observing, having mindfulness of thinking is okay to do when that thinking is harmless, is not harmful, or potentially beautiful thoughts such as renunciation, kindness and goodwill. The very short sutta really underscores that. where he kind of goes straight to the point here. Don't think bad, unskillful thoughts. Just, basic, just don't do it. Don't think bad, unskillful thoughts, such as sensual, malicious and cruel thoughts. Why is that? Because those thoughts aren't beneficial or relevant to the fundamentals of the spiritual life. They don't lead to disillusionment, dispassion and cessation, peace, insight, awakening and extinguishment. When you think, you should think. So now he's given, in this one, he gives us an alternate script. If you find yourself thinking sensual, malicious, cruel thoughts, just going, no, I will think this instead. This is suffering. What's suffering? Well, the having sensual, malicious or cruel thoughts is most certainly suffering, yeah? It's not fun at all. This is the origin of suffering. This is the cessation of suffering. This is the practice that leads to the cessation of suffering. Why is that? Because those thoughts are beneficial and relevant to the fundamentals of the spiritual life. Those thoughts lead to disillusionment, dispassion and cessation. This is why you should practice meditation. I think it's fairly straightforward, right? Don't think bad, unskillful thoughts. If they're arising, replace them with, this is suffering, this is the origin of suffering, this is the cessation of suffering, this is the practice that leads to the cessation of suffering. Why is that? Because those thoughts are beneficial and relevant to the fundamentals of the spiritual life. I love the Buddha's short, pithy, sock it to him. So there's me two kinds of thought. And the last sutta I wanted to look at tonight was how to stop thinking. So in the last sutta, the Buddha said, don't do it, right? Don't think bad, unskillful thoughts. Now, for some people, they could just go, okay, no, not going to do it, okay? For some people, we need a little bit more help on how to do that. And so, the Buddha gives much more detailed instructions for those folks who need more detailed instructions. So here in How to Stop Thinking, he goes through 5 methods, and they're of increasing intensity. Basically, try the first one first, and then if that doesn't work, try the second one, and if that doesn't work, try the third one, etc. All right? The 5th one in particular is for really extreme cases. I actually think that probably most of the people out there are not ever going to need the fifth tool. The 5th tool is when negative thinking is so out of control that you're on the brink of taking evil action as a result. Or it's got to the point of affecting your mental health. So for most folks, for most of us, the first 2 or 3 are really all the tools you need. And the last couple, sort of when you really need to save them for when you need to pull out. Well, the last one in particular for when you need to pull out the big guns. So once again, I've heard that the Buddha was staying at Savatthi in Jeta's Grove in Anathapindika's monastery. So 2 of these Suttas on Thinking were delivered at Saurday. Perhaps he had a few folks there with problems with thinking. And there he addressed the mendicants, and the Buddha said this: a mendicant committed to the higher mind, adhicita manutena, should focus on 5 foundations of meditation from time to time. Pancha nimittani, so 5 nimittas. Bhante Sujato here is translating pancha nimittani as 5 foundations. Bhikkhu Bodhi used to, in his translations, translates it as 5 signs. So, foundations of meditation, or signs that you're going in the right direction perhaps, or signs that manifest, foundations that manifest while you're doing the practice. And what nimitta, what are these 5 nimittas, pancha nimittani, these 5 signs, these 5 foundations that we should focus on? So take a mendicant who is focusing on some foundation of meditation that gives rise to bad, unskillful thoughts connected with desire, hate and delusion. That mendicant or meditator should focus on some other foundation of meditation connected with the skillful. So let's pull that apart. A meditator, or someone who is focusing on some nimitta, some sign, some foundation. So focusing on something. And as a result of focusing on that something, bad, unskillful thoughts arise. So he's not saying what that something is, what that nimitta, what that foundation, what that sign is, but he's talking about the affect of focusing on that sign. In this situation, whatever it is that the person is paying attention to has given rise to bad, unskillful thoughts connected with desire. And in that situation, the Buddha says here that mendicant should focus on some other foundation, on some other sign, should focus on something else. Don't pay attention to that if, as a result of paying attention to that, unskillful, harmful thoughts arise. In the situation that paying attention to that causes unskillful thoughts to arise, pay attention to something else that is connected with the skillful. Like, this is the truth of suffering, this is the origin of suffering, May all beings be well and happy. Pay attention to something else connected with the skillful. And as they do so, taking their attention off this and putting it on that, those bad thoughts are given up and come to an end. Because the bad thoughts are given up and come to an end, their mind becomes stilled, it settles, etc. And the simile here is of a carpenter or their apprentice who'd knock out or extract a large peg with a finer peg. So if you think about in the old days having two pieces of wood fixed together, say part of a cart, and they're fixed together by boring a hole through and putting a peg through those two pieces. And if you wish to take the boards apart, then you get a smaller peg and knock out that larger peg. And so, in the same way, if your mind's being held together with this negative peg, you should knock out or extract that negative thinking or unhelpful, harmful thinking with a smaller peg of beneficial thinking. Knock it out. Knock it off. And in that same way, a mendicant should focus on some other foundation of meditation connected with the skillful. However, if that doesn't work, suppose that mendicant is focusing on some other foundation of meditation connected with the skillful, but bad, unskillful thoughts connected with desire, hate, and delusion keep coming up. They should examine the drawbacks of those thoughts. These thoughts are unskillful, they're blameworthy, they result in suffering. This is very similar to the analysis process we saw in two kinds of thinking. So in the first method, we just replace the negative thoughts with positive thoughts. We replace the harmful thoughts with beneficial thoughts. But if that doesn't work, if the beneficial thoughts don't stick and the harmful thoughts keep coming back, then we use method 2, as described in two kinds of thinking, of and analysing the ethical and moral quality of the thoughts. So these unskillful bad thoughts connected with desire, hate and delusion, these thoughts are unskillful, they're blameworthy, and they result in suffering. And as they do so, these bad thoughts are given up and come to an end. Their mind becomes stilled, it settles, unifies, and becomes immersed in samadhi. So suppose there was a woman or a man who was young, youthful, and fond of adornments. If the corpse of a snake or a dog or a human were hung around their neck, they'd be horrified, repelled, and disgusted. And in the same way, the mendicant should examine the drawbacks of those thoughts. Sometimes when we've got a strong habit of harmful thinking, particularly if it's subtle, for example, anxiety, worrying, grumpiness, greed, we start making excuses for ourselves, I always think like that. Those thoughts are always coming up. But, it's just such a strong habit, it's too hard to change. And when we make excuses for those harmful, unbeneficial thoughts, it's as if this woman or man who is young, youthful, and fond of adornments, if they've got this corpse hanging around their neck and they're like, yes, but I'm used to having a corpse around my neck. I've always got this corpse around my neck. It's really too too much trouble to take this disgusting oozing corpse off and have a shower? Really? That's what you want to do? We want to put up with those mental corpses stinking up our hearts? Ew. The Buddha really doesn't want us to put up with it. He doesn't want us to put up with having stinky mental corpses hanging around our minds. And these unskillful, blameworthy, suffering thoughts, why do we put up with them? Why do we let them hang around? So if we examine the drawbacks of those thoughts, those bad thoughts that are given up and come to an end, hopefully. Now, suppose that we're working really hard at this and we are in fact examining this thought with mindfulness, and we're examining the drawbacks of the thought with mindfulness, but the habit's strong, the mind's strongly inclined that way, and those bad, unskillful thoughts connected with desire, hate and delusion keep coming up. They should try to ignore and forget about them. This is particularly interesting because one teacher pointed out, and I've so far found them right, not wrong on this, that this is the only place in the Tripitaka, in the Bible, in the Tripitaka, that the Buddha says, forget it. In fact, it's actually asati, the opposite of mindfulness. Sati, mindfulness, asati, forget about it. Asati manasikaro. So there's yoniso manasikaro, wise reflection. Ayoniso manasikara, unwise reflection. Asati manasikaro, forget about that reflection. Forget about it. Let it go. And as they do so, those bad thoughts are given up and come to an end. Their mind becomes stilled internally. It settles, unifies, and becomes immersed in samadhi. So that's our first three methods to get rid of unwholesome thoughts. One, do you remember what the first one was? Thought replacement. Yeah? Replace the negative thought with the positive thought. 2, thought analysis. Analyze that negative thought and see for yourself how it harms you. 3, forget about it. Just go, no, I'm not thinking that, and forget about it. But should those 3 not work, we've got number 4. Oh, there's the simile for the previous one of forgetting it. Suppose there was a person with good eyesight and some undesirable sights came into their range of vision. They just close their eyes or look away. So you close your mind against those thoughts and turn the mind away. In the same way, a mendicant forgets those thoughts, and those bad thoughts are given up and come to an end. Now suppose that mendicant is ignoring and forgetting about those thoughts. Vitakkasaṇṭhāna Sutta, but bad, unskillful thoughts connected with desire, hate and delusion keep coming up. They should focus on stopping the formation of thoughts, and as they do so, those bad thoughts are given up and come to an end. So, stopping the formation of thoughts some people have discussed that. Mariam was talking about that being looking at investigating in the mind how the thought forms, the causes, if this then that, and knowing that if this is present then those thoughts are likely to be triggered, then working with preventing the trigger that brings those thoughts up. I find this one's confusing, and when I look at the simile, I come to a slightly different idea, but probably complementary, the two things working together, as in looking at what feeds that thought process, where does the energy come from, as in stopping the formation of the thought in terms of not feeding it, not giving it energy. So the simile is, suppose there was a person walking quickly, they'd think, why am I walking so quickly? Why don't I slow down? So they'd slow down. They'd think, why am I walking slowly? Why don't I stand still? So they'd stand still. Then they'd think, why am I standing still? Why don't I sit down? So they'd sit down. They'd think, why am I sitting? Why don't I lie down? So they'd lie down. And so that person would reject successively coarser postures and adopt more subtle ones. In the same way, these thoughts are given up and come to an end. So when I look at that, that seems to me to be an ancient simile of changing down gears. Like in the modern world, we might say something like, I was speeding along the highway at 110 and then I came to the tunnel system and so I slowed down to 90, and then I thought, why am I going so fast, and I slowed down to 60, and then I thought, why don't I slow right down, and so I slowed down to 25, and then I slowed down and stopped. So that's like the same thing with walking, but we would call that changing down gears, preparing to stop, yeah? So how would we do that with the mind, right? So suppose there was a person walking quickly, so suppose my mind was spinning quickly and I was thinking quickly, and I'd think, why am I thinking so quickly? Why don't I slow down? So I'd think more slowly, and then I'd think, why am I thinking slowly? Why don't I just think one thing at a time? Yeah? Maybe so. Beginning with chanting, right? So I've got my mind spinning out in the world, so I'll do some chanting, because that's directed thinking, directing my thinking at a positive content, positive topic, but it's not quite as busy, or maybe it's at the same busyness as my mind, so that we're like just changing direction, and then we start changing gears. So first of all, we chant something very complicated. Maybe we're going to chant Mahajaya Mangalam or Mangala Sutta or something nice and complicated. But perhaps chant something you don't know very well, so you have to pay attention to it. And then we might go to doing a directed meditation, like metta meditation, where you go through all the different categories of beings to send metta to. Or maybe you might do 32 body parts meditation, where you've got quite a complicated sequence to be thinking through. And then think something a bit slower. And then maybe go to mantra, Namo Tassa, and repeat Namo Tassa again and again, until you're ready to maybe just go Buddho, 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 until you don't need Buddho anymore in your mind. Stills. So here, doing successively less busy meditative practice, so that it allows the whatever's feeding that spinning to remove. So we're removing the power behind the formation of those thoughts by giving the mind something to think that's successively less busy, until eventually the mind's ready to settle and become still. So if your mind's really, really thinking, and this isn't for someone who can settle their mind. This is for someone who's really having some problems settling their mind and letting go of the thinking. So it may take a half an hour or more to go through this process before the mind settles enough to sit on the breath, or to sit in a state of metta. Yeah? Sometimes you've got to do the warm-up before you can do the exercise. Or the warm down in this case. Now the fifth one, as I've mentioned before, is the extreme case when your mind's perhaps heading out into slightly psychotic land, where it's completely out of control. Perhaps poor Angulimala had to practice like this at first. Who knows, Most of the time, for most of us, we don't need this fifth one. So, for some people, they're never going to use this. Some people might use it once or twice every now and again. There's only going to be a small number of people whose thinking is so out of control that they need this intense thing, this intense method. But if you happen to have a moment, that's okay, you can use it too. And this is the situation where you've used all the other methods, you've done all the other approaches, you've tried everything, and still unskillful thoughts connected with desire, hate and delusion just keep coming up. What you going to do? Well, with teeth clenched and tongue pressed against the roof of the mouth, they should squeeze, squash and torture mind with mind, which is something like this, no, I will not think that. As I said, most of the time, most people don't need to do that. But every now and again, there's a situation which is just not okay, and the thinking just will not go. That's, if you wake up in the middle of the night and these terrible thoughts just pulling you apart, and you tried chanting metta, and you tried having a hot chocolate, and still that horrid dream still persisting, or that horrid worry still riling you up. With teeth clenched and tongue pressed against the roof of the mouth, they should squeeze, squash, and torture mind with mind. And as they do so, those bad thoughts are given up and come to an end. And even their mind becomes stilled internally. It settles, unifies, and becomes immersed in samadhi. It's like a strong man who grabs a weaker man by the head or throat or shoulder and squeezes, squashes, and tortures them. I don't find our Buddha very insipid, really. He's got some strong, intense warrior speak here, hasn't he? It's not really surprising he talks like a warrior. He was trained as one. Squeezes, squashes, and tortures them. That's what we're going to do to those bad thoughts. We're going to squeeze and squash and torture them, and we're not going to allow their drippy, oozy corpses to hang around in our mind. Just no. No. And those bad thoughts are given up and come to an end. So now we run through the whole 5 again. So number 1, now take the mendicant who's focusing on some foundation of meditation that gives rise to bad, unskillful thoughts connected with desire, hate and delusion. They focus on some other foundation of meditation connected with skillful. Think about something else. And if that doesn't work, they examine the drawbacks of those thoughts. If that doesn't work, they try to ignore and forget about those thoughts. If that doesn't work, they focus on stopping the formation of thoughts. And if that doesn't work, with teeth clenched and tongue pressed against the roof of the mouth, they squeeze, squash and torture mind with mind. And when they succeed in each of these things, those bad thoughts are given up and come to an end. Their mind becomes stilled internally. It settles, unifies, and becomes immersed in samadhi. This is called a mendicant who is a master of the ways of thought. They'll think what they want to think, and they won't think what they don't want to think. Now that's a really powerful statement. Can you imagine what your mind would be like if you could think what you want to think and to never ever not think what you don't want to think? So this is how to become the boss of your own mind instead of allowing our minds to be the boss of us. To tame that mind. And ultimately, taming the mind will lead to they've cut off craving, untied the feathers, and by rightly comprehending conceit, have made an end of suffering. That is what the Buddha said, idam avocha bhagava. Satisfied, the mendicants were happy with what the Buddha said. Vitakkasaṇṭhāna Sutta nititang dasamam. And that is the end of the Vitakkasaṇṭhāna Sutta. So hopefully that will be of benefit and use to you. And I wonder if I can see if there's any comments or questions. Let's see if I can get the YouTube happening for me. And Buddhist Society. Oops, I'd better put that on mute or I'll be hearing myself. Okay. Oh, we've got 7 people out there. Hi, 7 people. And no comments or questions. Okay. Okay. Well, if there's no questions or comments, thanks, Timothy. Well, I will come to an end and finish the night with a short chant of Araham, and I'll put the computer down so I don't knock it off. Arahang Samma Sambuddho Bhagava Buddhaṃ Bhagavaṃ Abhivademi. Svakato Bhagavata Dhammo Dhammang namasami. Supatipanno Bhagavato Sāvaka Saṅgho Saṅgham namami. Thank you, everyone. Good night.